Okay, well, it's wonderful that you can join us all today for our webinar, which is Moving Into, Through and Beyond STEM Degrees, a Student Equity Perspective. I'd like to start today by acknowledging that I'm located on Whadjuk Noongar lands, and I wish to pay my deep respects to elders past and present and emerging, and to the Aboriginal community that continue to care for country. I stand for a future that profoundly respects and acknowledges Aboriginal perspectives, culture, language, and history, and a continued effort to fight for Aboriginal justice and rights, paving the way for a strong future. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Sarah O'Shea. I'm the Director of the National Centre for Student Equity in Higher Education, or as we call it, NESHE for short. NESHE is housed at Curtin University and is funded by the Commonwealth Government with a dedicated mission to improve the higher education access, participation, retention, success, and completion rates for marginalised and disadvantaged people through a variety of strategies, including research, practice, and policy. Today, we not only have a great webinar for you, but before we begin, I'd also like to acknowledge that it is Wear It Purple Day today, an international movement to stand in solidarity with Rainbow youth who are subject to bullying and harassment, and to those who've taken their lives as a result. This year's Wear It Purple theme is Start the Conversation, Keep It Going. And I do have my purple ribbon here on the backdrop. So I'm delighted to be able to bring you this webinar, which, as I said, is entitled Moving Into, Through and Beyond STEM Degrees, a Student Equity Perspective. And this is showcasing 3 projects that are funded by the NESHE to identify new opportunities at critical touch points across the educational journey to better support disadvantaged students in achieving employment in STEM fields. Each of the projects took an innovative approach to their research, and this relates to a specific stage of the student life cycle. So we have a total of 3 presentations, and each will present a snapshot of their findings. The reports for these grants are in the process of being released. So I would ask you to maybe sign up for the NESHE e-news or have a look on our social media to ensure that you know the release dates for all the reports. Before we start, just a few housekeeping details. This webinar is being live captioned by Bradley Reporting and will be recorded. The recording will be available on the NESHE website in the coming days. To activate the closed captions, click the CC button in the toolbar that is located on the top or the bottom of your screen. We also have captions available via browser, and we'll add that web link to the chat pod now. And if you have any technological difficulties, please email neshe@curtin.edu.au. Today, each of the presenters will provide a 10-minute presentation, and this will be followed by 5 minutes for Q&A. And if we have time at the end, then we will cover more questions in the Q&A box. As we begin, can I ask that everyone goes into the chat pod and introduces themselves? We have registrants from a range of educational sectors across Australia and also internationally today. So it's nice to meet each other. Perhaps include the land or the country you're currently located on as well. Please choose all panelists and attendees when you post. But if you have a question for the panel, please add that question in the Q&A box. So we are taking questions in the Q&A box, and you can also vote on questions posed by others. Okay, without further ado, I'm going to introduce the first presentation, which is entitled Pre-Access, Creativity in STEM Programs Shape Students' Attitudes and Intentions. And this will be presented by Associate Professor Simon Leonard and Dr. John Kennedy from the University of South Australia. So I'm going to turn my camera off now, and I'm going to ask John and Simon to start their presentation. So I'll stop sharing. And Simon and John, if you could turn on your cameras, thank you.
So, good afternoon to everybody. My name is Dr. John Kennedy, and as Sarah said, we're from the University of South Australia. My colleague, Professor Simon Leonard, is here with me as well. But before we begin, I want to acknowledge the country that we're on. I acknowledge that I'm joining this webinar from the traditional lands of the Dharawal people. UniSA is sited on the traditional lands of the Ghana people. So I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you all join us today, and I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. So, enhancing equitable access to higher education for students of diverse backgrounds has been a very high priority for universities and other HE institutions for well over a decade now. The first phase of the Equity Initiatives Framework focuses on pre-access, and it's best described as outreach activities aimed at schools and communities. The 2015 report by Bennett and al. Suggested that effective outreach programs have tended to focus on high schools and have centered around familiarizing school students with the university environment, as well as developing high expectations and aspirations in students. At the same time as this equity conversation has been going on, another policy discourse has happened, that of the decline of participation of students in STEM pathways at school and at university. Similarly to the response to equity issues, outreach programs have been promoted as a response to dealing with this area of concern. And we've tended to provide solutions that address similar approaches to those discussed in the Equity Initiatives Framework. University STEM programs have often had the dual objectives of increasing and at the same time diversifying participation in scientific educational pathways and scientific career pathways, as well as broadening students' capacity to engage in socio-scientific decision-making. So the big question is, are we having an impact? In Australia alone, across government, industry, and universities, the cost of investment into these programs runs into the hundreds of millions of dollars each year, and they represent one of the major focal points for efforts to increase participation in higher education from equity groups. Many of these programs are actually designed on an ad hoc basis, and the design of STEM outreach programs in particular has become quite diverse. It's ranging from simple talks by STEM professionals, short experience of scientific phenomena, think about a chemistry show, or extended and complex challenges like NASA's EPIC Challenge program. Unfortunately, there are a number of challenges with many outreach programs that make it difficult to measure the lasting impact of a specific program. In particular, evaluation is often of the program as a whole and not the individual bits, so we don't really know what works. And evaluation tends to be summative, so we don't know how students grow over time. So the project we undertook was an attempt to get at what really motivates and blocks students' enrollment decisions about STEM and STEM-related study beyond school. We needed to look at attitudes they hold about STEM subjects at school, as those offer the most exposure to schools. If you think about it, a STEM outreach program does not operate in isolation to school, but generally supports school STEM teaching, and it offers touch points where change can be initiated. At first glance, you might think it is enough to consider if students have a positive or negative attitude towards school science or school STEM. But in previous work, it's been shown that attitudes are neither fixed nor unidimensional. Not being fixed is good for us. It's important because it gives us potential opportunities to influence students' perceptions and their decisions. However, attitudes being multidimensional potentially requires a more nuanced and holistic approach to measurement. In our earlier work, we developed the Student Attitude Survey, or the SAS. This measures 9 interrelated attitudinal constructs. The SAS tool allows us to build up an attitude picture or a profile that allows us to gain a more well-rounded understanding of each student's rating of attitude towards each of these constructs. Over time, we're then able to see how these attitudes change, adapt, and evolve as the student experiences their educational journey. More than attitudes being multidimensional, it's clear that school is multidimensional. For example, if your students only experience science classes taught by one teacher in an environment where they were not exposed to other subjects or other ways of thinking, it would be completely reasonable to expect their attitudes towards school science would develop independently of other experiences at school. But in reality, this is very much the opposite. The SAS is a unique web-based tool. It allows us to capture students' attitudes within this complex system. We capture their attitudes to all their subjects across all 9 of those previously mentioned constructs. It is personalized. The tool is personalized to each individual student, and it uses local terminology for each of the courses listed. Students log in once or twice a term, verify their subjects are the same as the last time. If they've picked up or dropped a subject, they can change their subjects from their list. On the next page, the sliders, as you can see in the image on the screen, are preloaded to the student's last values. So they naturally indicate how their attitudes have changed between measurement points. Because the sliders for one construct are presented across all subjects, students naturally rate their subjects relative to each other. Ultimately, we end up with 2 types of score. We end up with a composite aptitude rating, which tells us how the students feel about their subjects on average at school. And we end up with a subject-specific attitude rating, which tells us what their attitude is like relative to their attitude towards school as a whole. So the project report, which is on the NESHE website, has 7 recommendations, and these are relevant for outreach programs, which are aiming to improve participation and equitable access to STEM pathways. However, in this short time, we're going to briefly explore some of the data behind recommendations. Programs that aim to impact students' attitudes of enjoyability, relevance, and self-efficacy should consider using creativity as a driving principle during the educational design phase. So, in the first of our 3 case studies, we were originally going to look at evaluating the impact of outreach programs on student attitudes. But the research happened in 2020, and we all know what happened there. So we pivoted to look at capturing some baseline attitudes in schools that we were able to connect with. This first case study then pivoted to look at baseline attitudes towards science and maths at this large multi-campus school in metropolitan South Australia. 1,546 students contributed data from across year 6 to 12, with approximately 50-50 representation from male and female students. The school itself has 2% of its students reporting as being Indigenous, and around 11% report having a non-English speaking background. The school itself represents a good range of different SES backgrounds. So what we see here, we can slightly generalize to other contexts. Overall, what we see is that students find school generally to be a positive experience. Anytime a rating bar is above 0, that's a positive outcome, that's useful. So anxiety and difficulty have been reversed here. So a high marker is a good thing, and a low marker is a not so good thing. What we see from this picture here is, if you look at the size of the whiskers, we have a huge range in attitudes. They also have good intentions in some areas towards further study in their school subjects, but also there's a lot of outliers at top and bottom. So even in the school setting, students are actually deciding what is relevant to them and how they're going to address that. If we look at the school science attitudes, we find that as we go across this picture, the students get older across the bottom. So our year group is across the bottom, and these are averaged just for science. This tells us how students feel about science relative to their other subjects. So you can see that older students tend to report higher levels of anxiety and difficulty in their science subjects, which is not overly surprising because we know the subject gets more complicated. Students will report a wide range of intentions towards further study. you can see the width of the box gets bigger as they get older. And students' intentions towards further study in science are more positive than their other subjects on average. There doesn't seem to be much variation between year groups in terms of opportunities to be creative, though. So that could be a useful thing to leverage off. If we look at the same sort of thing for mathematics, we see that mathematics subject anxiety is generally higher. The bars are lower than for all their other subjects. And even though mathematics is a little more difficult than other subjects, students do have positive intentions towards it. The opportunity to be creative in mathematics is, though, lower in older students. So they're creative when they're younger, and when they're older, it's harder. So why am I focusing on opportunities for creativity? In the second case study, which you can read about in the report itself, we found that creativity is very closely correlated with enjoyability, self-efficacy, and relevance in both science and mathematics. Other research has shown that those three attitude constructs link quite closely to the concept of engagement. We've also known that creativity is a skill set that can be explicitly taught. So might creative thinking therefore be able to offer a framework for developing effective outreach programs? We know from the EIF, the Equitable Initiative Framework, that the third goal is to support and develop aspirations and expectations. In this project, even though it's a very small snapshot, we found students' attention towards STEM disciplines, science, technology, engineering, maths. Well, they vary greatly between those subjects. They also vary significantly between the age of the students. And they vary differently between attitudinal factors. All that difference tells us is that a one-size-fits-all solution is unlikely to be helpful. So when you're developing an outreach program, we need to adopt a number of highly focused learning designs, and these need to be appropriately targeted at the correct student audience to be most effective. That's the end of my 10 minutes. This research has been funded by Neshi. Please read the full report, because in 10 minutes we can't do it justice. And I'm going to stop the screen share so we can deal with any questions that have come up in the Q&A box.
Thank you, John. That was excellent. I think you were having a few issues with your mic there, so there's been a bit of chat. So you might need to lean in a little bit closer when we answer the questions. But we did have some questions prior to the session, which I just thought I'd start with. I'm wondering, did the research identify this question is from, it was a pre-question. Did the research identify any ideal age for student outreach programs to maximize engagement in STEM?
So hopefully this microphone is working better. The different ages, there isn't a single one ideal age. Mathematics seems to be, needs to target younger. Science seems to want to target about year 8 or year 9. But other parts of the research has shown that we need to not assume that all year 8 students are the same. So we need to address different parts of each age group at different levels. But the big takeaway is, no, there isn't one ideal time. It varies depending on what you're trying to do, which attitudes you're trying to address, and which subject area you're trying to work with.
Great. Yeah, thank you. And what are the, just one last question before we move on to the next presentation. What are your next steps with this research? Have you got plans to build upon it and bring it to another level?
So we're using the outputs of this research to help guide what we're doing with our outreach programs at UniSA to start with. The UniSA Connect program, we're developing that to bring down into that middle high school to try to address some of the issues that we found. But we're also trying to work with schools with this sort of data to work on the programs and initiatives that they're developing to help them evaluate their effectiveness on the ground, as it were, at the chalk face.
Great, thank you so much. Obviously, in 10 minutes, we can't do justice to the great research that you've both done. So I know Nina's popped the link into the chat box, which will bring everyone straight to your report, which is already up on the NESHE webpage. So thank you very much. I'm going to ask Jen Jackson now to turn on her camera. And Jen is going to talk about reimagining participation, equity lessons from a radical first-year model for STEM students at Victoria University. So over to you, Jen.
Thanks, Sarah, and hi, everyone. Joining you today from Wurundjeri country in beautiful lockdown Melbourne. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners and the elders here in Wurundjeri country, also in all the lands of Victoria University campuses and the lands that we're all meeting from today, and the rich traditions of knowledge that have existed in all of those parts of the country over many generations. I'd also like to acknowledge my co-researchers on this project, Associate Professor Kathy Tangalakis from First Year College at VU, and Dr. Peter Hurley, who works with me at the Mitchell Institute. And our project is called Inside the Black Box of the Block Model. And there's nothing more exciting as a researcher than opening up a black box and rummaging around inside. So thanks for joining me today as we do that. I'd like to acknowledge my colleagues at VU who are part of this project as participants, because when we opened up this black box of the block model, which is the model they use to teach in first year college, we were interrogating their practice, and having a nosy Parker from a policy institute come along and interrogate your practice with first year students, you have to be pretty brave to allow that to happen. But if you take nothing else away from my presentation today, it's that the block model is full of brave, I would say enthusiastic people who are really passionate about their students, are really passionate about great teaching. And if you wanted one factor to take away, why has this made a difference? Just sit with that one. All right, so you can make a cuppa or you can hang around and find out how we discovered that. I'm just going to share my screen. Give me just one sec. Okay, so here's our project. The block model is an innovative model at Victoria University, introduced in 2018, where subjects are taught one by one in intensive 4-week blocks, rather than in semesters with multiple subjects happening at once. And what we knew going into the project was that first year student engagement and outcomes, so pass rates and grades, had improved from pre-block to block, and particularly amongst equity group students. So the obvious research question is, what's going on there? How is this working? And we focused on STEM because we know it's an area of challenge for equity group students, and we know it's really important for students' future careers. Our methods, Peter Hurley did some quantitative analysis of our VU data just to make sure those trends across the university were also present in the STEM subjects, and they were, including for the equity group students. And then we dived into interviews and focus groups with 7 VU leaders, 11 academic teaching staff working in first year, and also block model students, so students who'd done their first year in the block. Here's what we found. Looking inside the block model, basically we found exactly the same ingredients that you would find in any university to support student participation, but used differently. So I'm going to talk you through some of those differences. You can read about all the permutations of that in our report. But there were 4 really groups of resources that were being deployed differently in the block model from how they normally would be for student participation. So time, more time on task and more purposeful learning. Relationships, students and teaching staff learning together. That reconfiguration of the relationship is so important. Using knowledge, connecting evidence around good teaching and the first year experience and student participation from outside the university, but also inside the university. So making that connection between evidence and context. And lastly, data. And I've said there, continuous curiosity about student learning, because often we think about data as, okay, great, we've got lots of spreadsheets. But what's important with how data is used in this case is it's driven by curiosity. It's driven by that excitement, that interest in what can we do to make the learning for our students better. As we go through the findings, what I've done is just draw out a few quotes around each of these themes, because I think the best way to bring them to life for you is actually to hear from the participants themselves. And you can read more of these fantastic insights in the report when it comes up online on the NETI website, which I think will be soon. Okay, so first theme. Increased time on task and purposeful learning. Now, obviously the block model reconfigures time, so it compresses those subjects into intensive blocks. And what we heard students say was it's definitely not easier. The workload was actually intensive for both students and staff, but that focus on one subject at a time was enabling students to get more out of their learning. And that comment from the student there was common across a number of conversations. What surprised us a bit more was that the academics were saying it too. And we've got a great honest quote there that in the traditional models, the semester model, you might have 8 or 9 weeks where there's not that much to do, and then all hell breaks loose. And you've got the rush at the end, and the block staged the workload much more evenly. The last quote there from a leader who is one of the architects of the block is that using time well, time on task, is one of the most cost-effective things you can do to improve student learning. So this isn't about more money, it's about using what you have. Next, students and teaching staff learning together. The relationships really came through in the interviews as central to the block model success. So once you've got teaching staff and students together for those intensive periods, for those long periods of working together, they get to know one another, and you get this sense of a shared commitment to everybody succeeding. And you can see that in the quote from the student there. They're really invested. The students are feeling this, that the teaching staff care whether they do well. The academic quote there is about the relationships, not only between students and teaching staff, but between students themselves. So the intensive blocks enable students to build relationships with one another as well as with the staff. And the last quote on this slide gets to something really significant about the block model, which was the creation of first-year college to deliver it. So VU actually pulled together dedicated staff to teach first year, and those staff were chosen because they were passionate about teaching. And then they got thrown this block model as a problem to solve collectively. They didn't know how they were going to do it. They had to transform all the curriculum, but they had to work together in that in interdisciplinary ways. And what we saw in the interviews was the staff really getting behind that and saying they've got a professional learning community, interdisciplinary professional learning community around great teaching. And I can tell you when COVID struck and we were doing the interviews in the middle of COVID, you could see that energy and innovation fueling their adaptation to the COVID environment. And I'll acknowledge my co-researcher, Kathy, who was one of those amazing teaching staff. Connecting evidence. What do I mean by this? All right, so we talk a lot about evidence-based practice in first year, but it's got to relate to the context. The first quote is around the global best practice that informed the block model. It's a model that's been used overseas, and it was kind of a light bulb moment. The EU had already been using transition pedagogies and some great evidence-based practice, but the block kind of gave a new way to configure that. The second quote might surprise you. This is around responding to the organizational context. So VU was in a bit of financial strife when the block came in, and there it is on the page. And the block actually provided a solution to organizational challenges as well as being based on best practice. And I think that's what's really significant about it in the current moment, because there are a lot of universities facing organizational challenges at the moment. So this fact that you can do something that responds to those challenges and delivers better outcomes. It's not, it's necessity is the mother of invention, I think, is the takeaway there. And that last point, that it needs to respond to the students themselves. So VU does have a mix with a lot of equity for its students. Last slide, data-driven curiosity. So reconfiguring what is a great academic. A great academic is one who's constantly improving their teaching as well as their research, and building that culture of research around teaching. Being curious about your students, the second quote there. If you're teaching interdisciplinary classes, you can't just assume that they're your regular group of students. You have to think, who is actually in there? Where have they come from? What's their academic background? What are their aspirations? And the last one is getting the students to monitor their own learning, and the constant assessment in the block, because you're not waiting to the end of semester to get your first pass fail. That was something that really drove student motivation. That was a whirlwind tour of how to use some everyday resources that are just lying around in universities in different ways. Hopefully it's provoked for you some ways that you might think about using this, and you don't have to do the block model to make some of these changes. So I leave you with that provocation. Thanks, Sarah.
Thanks, Jen. I'm going to declare up front that I'm a huge fan of the block model. And I think this piece of research that you've done is really insightful, because I've read the report, and the report is coming out in about 2 weeks. Again, I'll ask everyone to follow us closely if you want to read Jen's report, because it's well worth reading. And I have a question here from Michelle. Michelle asks, does your research indicate that universities really need to look very closely at their delivery and assessment cycles? And then she follows up by asking, how likely are universities to embrace this idea? So tricky question.
I love the double-headed question. Thanks, Michelle. Firstly, does it mean they need to look closely at what they're doing? I would say yes, because I think innovation, there's been writing in the past around the need for innovation in Australian universities. I'm not saying VU is the only one innovating, not by a long chalk. There's lots of great work happening. But another quote we had from one of the leaders was, if you looked at the traditional model of university and tried to find an evidence base for why that works for students, you'd be struggling. Okay, stick them in a lecture, talk at them for an hour. Hard to find. Okay, so second part of the question, can it happen that universities can change their practices? Oh, look, after 2020, what's not possible? We all did an awful lot of changing, and I think now is the time to have those conversations where the sector is a bit reinventing itself.
Thanks, Jen. I have one last question for you, which is one that was asked more generally to everyone, but I think it's quite pertinent for you in terms of the block model. And the question from Kim is, how can universities or higher education sectors support those students in an equity group that are also working, either full-time or part-time, to get these STEM qualifications? As often they have caring responsibilities and they need to work and have less time to study. And I just wondered, from the perspective of the block model, how did you cater to those students who also had commitments outside of university?
Another great question, and this wasn't as clear cut in the research as I expected it to be. I expected it to be putting everything in blocks makes it easier for part-time work and family, because you've got specific chunks of time you're at university and chunks of time you're not. Actually, the intense workload sometimes made that harder. So for some students, it was harder, for some it was easier. But I think the key thing was that the lecturers, the academic teaching staff knew their students. So if the student was having trouble navigating, doing that work-family balance, they could speak to their teacher and create a solution. And if they were learning things in their job that they could bring into the class, they had opportunities to do that. And likewise, so there's much more connection between students' lives and what they're doing in the university experience that I think just creates more opportunity for differentiation.
Great, thanks for that. I'm going to ask you to stop sharing your screen if you wouldn't mind, and invite Dan Edwards to come up now to present on his and his team, which includes Sarah Buckley and also Sam. And Dan is going to talk about attainment and transition out, entering the STEM workforce, the impact of equity, motivation, and prior achievement.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I'll just get my screen to share. Thank you very much for inviting us to be part of this panel, and to everyone who is on the panel and listening to. We're coming from Melbourne and various parts of Victoria actually for my team. I'm personally in Melbourne on Wurundjeri land. We'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people and also all Indigenous people and the work that they have done in the past and in the future towards improving education for all Australians. Sarah has gone through the overall title of our work, and I think it'll become clear as I go through too. But I just wanted to say that we're talking about entering the STEM workforce, and this is just one of sort of three parts of this research project that was funded by NESHE. The NESHE grant has been great for us at ACER because it has sparked this research, and we also like to thank the other some of our internal funding from ACER, which helped to supplement the work. I'm here with Dr. Sarah Buckley and Dr. Sam Rothman. They're online and they'll be around for questions in the questions section. But we'd also like to acknowledge the work of Dr. Julie McMillan, who led the grant application and the project conceptualization of this research. She's not able to be with us today for this presentation, but it's important that we just acknowledge that this was her idea. We're just sharing it with everybody. We're from the Australian Council for Educational Research, and there's some information there about who we are, just in case you don't know who we are. The beauty of this project is that it links so closely to the mission of our organisation, which is to improve learning across the lifespan. I'm going to give you a quick run through of the research questions and the broad project, and then focus in on the stuff that we're going to be talking about today. I urge you to have a look at the research report, which is on the NESHE website now, because those questions that are listed here will be much more satisfactory in their answers than what I'm going to be able to give you today. Overall, the project was looking at pathways from secondary school all the way through to the workforce. Today's presentation is really focusing on the workforce aspect, that transition into the workforce, into the STEM workforce in particular. But if I have time, I will sort of go back to that secondary school aspect, because there were some really interesting findings that we had there that we're really keen to share as well. I'm not going to spend too much time on the methodological stuff, but to say all of our data used the longitudinal survey of Australian youth and cohort Y03. This is work that charts the transitions of young people from 15 to 25 and looks at a whole range of different aspects. This group in particular also undertook the Program for International Student Assessment, or PISA, at age 15. And later you'll see, or I'll talk about why that was particularly important for the research that we did here about the persistence and ongoing transitions through and into STEM. The equity groups, we were able to look in detail at 4 equity groups listed there, and also the numbers are in the table there. But they are non-metropolitan or RRR students, first in family to university, winter, which is the women in traditional areas, and low socioeconomic status students. To get to where we're going to finish, I just wanted to give you a snapshot of the earlier findings from our research, which mirror a lot of research that's out there. You can see the dot points there, and I'm not going to go through them in detail, The last couple, though, I did want to pause on a little bit. One thing that we found about STEM in this is that for those students from equity groups who go on to university, which is a lower proportion than overall, but for those who do go on, the take-up level of STEM is similar to the take-up level of STEM for other groups, except for women. Once at university, the completion rates of equity group students are lower. They're lower across the board, and we know that from prior research. What this research also showed is that within the equity groups, STEM completion rates were lower relative to the other people in their group. That's important, and it's delved into more in our report. The exception to this, again, is women who complete university at much higher rates, whether that's in STEM or in any of the other subjects. But the focus of this presentation is really about entering the STEM workforce. For that YO3 cohort, and of that YO3 cohort who began a university STEM course, we found that by the time they reached 25, they had very high employment rates. See that there? About 22% or 1 in 5 were in a STEM qualification, STEM qualified occupation. So an occupation that required a university degree, and a further 9% were in a mixed STEM occupation, which is a job requiring either vet or university STEM qualifications. Half of this cohort were working in occupations that didn't require a STEM qualification or a health qualification. What does that look like, though, for the equity groups that we're looking at? And this is where our research was particularly pointed for Neshi. As you can see from this graph, the pathways into the STEM workforce were different for different groups. Particularly troublesome, in inverted commas, were the outcomes for low SES students and women who had undertaken the STEM qualification. For women, less than 1 in 5 who had done STEM at university were in a STEM occupation that required a university qualification by the time they were 25. A similar proportion for low SES. When we add other STEM occupations, so STEM occupations that might require vet or university, still less than a quarter of that cohort who had done STEM at uni were in a STEM qualified occupation. That contrasts quite sharply to the non-equity group box at the far left of that graph. Delving a little bit more deeply into this and looking at the full spectrum of pathways for each of these groups, this graph shows where people went, whether they went to a STEM qualified occupation, that could be university, vet or mixed, a health qualified occupation where they need a health qualification to get in, another occupation, studying, or not in the labour force or unemployed. What you can see here is that for non-metropolitan, low SES and winter students, at least 50% of these students who studied STEM are not in a STEM occupation at age 25. For low SES and winter, you can also see that the health qualified occupations or health occupations in some ways offset to a certain extent the difference in the low numbers of STEM qualified STEM occupations that they transitioned into. It's also interesting to look at those profiles, perhaps if that's a good word, with the no equity group profile for the STEM university enrollees. You can see it's quite different, especially in relation to, so obviously in relation to the number or the proportion who are going into a STEM occupation, but also in relation to the health qualified occupations as well. Quite a different mix. So I'd like to now just trace back to the university to school transition. And this does link in a little bit with the Flinders work that was talked about earlier, just to give you some brief insight into factors related to STEM participation that we found. As I mentioned earlier, we used PISA data to explore persistence in maths and science. Now, PISA in the YO3 cohort was particularly interesting because there was a focus on mathematics literacy. It meant that this work, we could look at all the things listed here, a range of different measures, around student motivation and mathematics. We found that mathematics achievement at age 15 is a strong predictor of entry to university, and that's well known. However, what we also found is that it didn't necessarily differentiate pathways into STEM. So you can still be good at maths and you're getting into university, but that wasn't a differentiating factor as to whether that student then took a STEM pathway. What we did find were differentiating factors to STEM pathway were two concepts that came through PISA: instrumental motivation in mathematics and mathematics self-concept. And this is where it starts to link back to the research that you heard from Flinders just before. What we found was that, instrumental motivation in mathematics is a measure that looks at the extent to which we see students see the utility of mathematics for their future studies and work. What we found that among the YO3 cohort was that positive responses to questions about instrumental motivation increase the likelihood that these students would enroll subsequently in STEM fields of education. That's even after controlling for achievement. The particularly strong factor for this study was that low SES students with positive responses in instrumental motivation were more than 2.5 times as likely to choose a STEM university subject. Self-concept, mathematics self-concept was the other one we talked about, and that's sort of looking at students' belief in their own mathematical abilities. We found again that positive responses to questions around math self-concept were a predictor of entry to university in the STEM fields, this time just for low SES, first in family and women, when we control for all these other measures that we were talking about before. This is really interesting too, because this was not a factor that we found as significant for people who weren't in equity groups or who were for regional, rural and remote areas. There's something quite interesting in that, and we're happy to take some questions around this as we go through. Questions around the STEM profile in particular would be welcome. I've put a little bit here, but I'm not going to spend any more time talking about it. I think we'll just pause there and then we can have some questions. There were recommendations in our report too. Again, I'm putting them up, but we would implore people to just go and have a look at our report to get more out of that in terms of the recommendations. So hopefully there might be some questions, and my co-authors may join me because they're the ones who are going to answer these questions, I hope. Thanks.
Thank you, Dan. That was great. Thank you for sharing your research with us. And as you mentioned, your report is live on the NESHE website as well. And as you can probably tell, we have lucky to have such engaged researchers that take up the NESHE funding. And so I'm sure none of them would object to people emailing them after the presentation or following up individually. And again, you can see that their details are all included on their presentations. But I do have one question for you, and this came in earlier. How do your findings about instrumental motivation measured at, say, age 15 as being a key predictor of persisting with the STEM pathway, how do those match up with other research in the area? Is there correlation across the research on this topic?
I might ask Sarah if she would mind being party to that out. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan, and thanks, Sarah. Yes, it does match up well with the research. So, across the research literature, there's a trend that suggests that in early adolescence, there is a sort of STEM profile, which Dan was sort of alluding to before. So, a pattern of characteristics. For instance, valuing maths for its usefulness for your future, which is what PISA calls instrumental motivation, in combination with having high prior achievement in maths and science, in being confident about your abilities, also having lower levels of maths anxiety. So having this type of profile in early adolescence seems, well, the research suggests that could be a key predictor of whether or not students are likely to persist along the STEM pathway into higher education.
Okay, thank you. And just another quick question for the team as well. This comes from Tim, who asks, you know, it looks like overall employment is roughly the same for all the groups, or is that an oversimplification? What was it sort of similar, the employment?
Yeah, I'm happy to answer unless Sam wants to.
Yeah, I think I could answer that. Well, there is a matter with a lot of the groups is that you might be a rural student, but you could also be first in family. So there is a lot of mixing there. Each of those groups was separate, was considered separately. So that if you're a woman, you might be in the winter group, you might be in the non-metropolitan group, and in any other. So in that sense, there is a little bit of mixing, and it does look like for a lot of the equity groups that there is a similarity. That's why we had the no equity group included in there, to say that group, they didn't fall into any of the equity group categories, and that's the group that's different in employment.
Thanks, Sam. And sort of to follow up a little bit on that, do you have any plans to look at intersections of equity groups? So to sort of try and capture that intersectionality?
If we did, we'd have some very small numbers in a lot of those cases. So it becomes very difficult. For the same reason we couldn't do an Indigenous group, because the numbers in ELSE are that small.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for that great presentation. I'm just going to ask everyone now to turn on their cameras and to unmute themselves. So we are sort of moving to sort of a bit of a panel discussion now. And I don't have any questions as such in the chat pod. But actually, sorry, Michelle has popped a question in here that I think some of you may be able to answer. And Michelle's question is there the potential to identify the mathematical concepts that are being developed in other subjects at high school, including the design and technology fields, maybe looking at pathways beyond the traditional subject headings? I see a lot of nodding heads, so I'm Sarah, you're nodding your head, and Dan, you're nodding your head. So please, if one of you would like to jump in.
I think that Michelle brings out a beautiful point. I think, you know, if one of the things from our research suggests that helping younger students see the usefulness of maths for lots of different careers may be one of the key things that helps them to persist along a pathway. And one of the things I should have said before is that equity groups are less likely to display the characteristics of those important STEM profile, of that important STEM profile in early adolescence. So if we can help these students see the usefulness in lots of different subjects, then that's important. And I think, just following up from that very briefly, is it's important that they understand the value of maths from accessible role models. So they have to see themselves in the people that are telling them that maths is useful. I think that's quite key.
Oh, thank you, Sarah. And I suppose that in a way leads into a nice sort of final general question, which is, if I could get each of you just to reflect about the importance of student self-confidence as a theme across all your research, and how we might foster that within the higher education sector. And I'm going to start with the first presentation. Sorry, John, I'm going to put you on the spot a little, but if either of you had any feedback or thoughts about that.
Well, the self-confidence is going to be very closely related to our measures of self-efficacy and subject anxiety and subject difficulty. And what we're seeing, at least in the school level, is that students are reporting those differently across different domains. They correlate quite well, as I said, with creativity, and often creativity has been thought of as being fairly common across domains. But in the extended part of the research, we actually found that approaches to creativity are actually different and across domains. So you can't just take something from design technology and drop it into maths. So we do need to get some, going back to the previous question, we do need to get some of this interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary learning happening in schools so that when they get to university, hopefully they'll be able to pick it up there and carry on with that interdisciplinary and systems, complex systems thinking about the world. That's my take on it.
Thank you. Simon, did you have anything to add? Or?
Yeah, I'd say one thing we've found in some of our research is the importance of making sure we're teaching the thinking skills that go with the maths in particular. And we see that done relatively poorly. We get a content focus becoming in and saying we need to actually think about how in the STEM disciplines, there's kinds of thinking like spatial reasoning and computational thinking, and we're finding the explicit teaching of those skills that a lot of kids in the equity group seem to have not as well developed, leads to an improvement in confidence and an improvement, I'd say, in identity as someone who can do maths, someone who can do science.
Thank you. I'll move on to Jen now. Jen, do you have any final thoughts on that topic?
I think in our research, the self-confidence question played out at two levels. There was self-confidence, I can do university, and all the things that the first year college has done to make the university environment a place where all students feel they belong. And then there's that question of I can do STEM, which I think is a really hard one. What we saw that was novel in that, I think, was around the interdisciplinary classes, the chance for students to see all the different types of people and careers in which STEM can be used, which really broadened their understanding of what was possible and their own identity in that. And also that continuous assessment, that feeling of progress, but that has to be really finely balanced, because we did have some academics say you're not doing students any favors if you give them a good grade, just to boost their confidence. So that has to be couched in a really clear understanding of the learning process and a realistic understanding of where they're at.
Thank you, Jen. And Dan and the team, Sarah, Sam, would one of you like, or all of you, to give your thoughts on that question?
Well, I'll echo what Sarah has already said before around the confidence building through, especially for equity groups, for being able to see themselves in role models or in examples or in the way that things the way that things are presented in a classroom and beyond. I think we see that as particularly important. But I am not the expert in our team for this. So I think Sam or Sarah, if you have anything more to add, please. No?
Okay, well, on that note, I will start to finish up by thanking you all very much for giving up your time in your various locations, in your various homes, as most of you are working from home, for participating in this today. As I've said, all the research is available on the NESHE website. So I've put the details up there. If anyone would like to go into the website, have a look at the reports. Jen's is going to be up there in a few weeks, but the other two reports are both up there. And again, just thank you all for participating in this and for managing, I have to say, all kudos to each of you for managing research in a very, very difficult environment last year. So all these projects were conducted throughout 2020. And so I think it's a huge achievement to have done that and to have submitted your report and to have it at this stage. So thank you all for joining us today, and we look forward to hearing more about your research. Bye, everyone.